Dave Wedge's point, Misty Marris, if it's not Karen Reed, then who is it, right? That is, you know, that you don't want to forget about the victim in the case like this. Anything on that, Misty, from you?
Yeah, absolutely. Karen Reed has now been acquitted, so no action can be taken against her. That would be double jeopardy, but nothing stops investigators from pursuing other leads and continuing an investigation and maybe even charging somebody with this crime. Now, keep in mind, Karen Reed raised a theory that it's somebody else was involved. John O'Keefe went into the house, maybe got into an altercation. That theory was raised. She did not have to prove that. It was raised for the purposes of creating reasonable doubt. So we've heard that theory throughout the course of the first trial and the second trial, but no one else has ever been charged with a crime associated with this case. So there's the possibility that one of those leads or another lead could be pursued, and ultimately somebody else could be charged. Will that happen? We don't know at this particular time. I would imagine maybe the O'Keefe family would push it. We heard her father there say, we don't want this case to be reopened. And I don't know what he meant by that, but perhaps it's that there's just finality now with respect to Karen. But Connell, to your point, there's the O'Keefe family, and that's the victim in the case, and maybe there'll be other leads that are pursued.
There was a house in question. Again, the background on this is they all went out drinking, and no doubt Karen Reed and everybody else was drunk, really drunk that night. And, you know, that's the one charge she gets, the driving under the influence charge or something close to it. And then they go back to a house, the Albert house, right, Dave Wedge, where that's a cop. And his wife's there, a bunch of friends are there, a bunch of other cops are there. And Karen's story was, I dropped John off at the house, and John went in, and that was it. Something happened. Of course, the prosecution story was that they got in an argument, I guess, outside the house, and that Karen ran him over with her SUV in front of the house and left him to die in the snow. It was a really snowy night in the front lawn. But the people in the house, Dave, were the people that the defense wanted to have a closer look at, right?
That's right. You know, in the first trial, they really pointed the finger at Brian Albert's nephew, Colin Albert, who's a college student. In this trial, they really pointed the finger very hard at Brian Higgins, who's a federal agent for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. He had an office at the Canton Police Department. He was good friends with all these people. He was there that night. He was involved in some romantic flirting, at least, with Karen Reed, if not more. And, you know, the prosecution, I'm sorry, the defense during the closing statements talked about Brian Higgins. And, you know, so that's someone that they think may have been involved. And, again, to Misty's point, you know, the defense never had to prove anything. They just had to poke reasonable doubt in the prosecution's case. And frankly, it was not a very difficult job with the evidence that was there. All the experts said there was no evidence that he was hit by a car, none, zero. And even the prosecution's experts, even the medical examiner said there was no injuries consistent with a car accident.
Did people think it was a dog bite? I mean, that lady was telling Marcus, I've heard a lot of people say that.
That's right. I mean, you know, you look at the arm of John O'Keefe and your first instinct is dog bite. Investigators I've talked to, police officers say that, you know, they're cuts from a car accident. That's common. You can get cuts like that from any sort of collision or pedestrian being hit by a vehicle. But clearly that weighed into the jury's mind, and they didn't believe it. And, you know, they had plenty of reasonable doubt here. And I think that's the reason they arrived at the verdict they did.
Hey, Dave, one other thing for you. I mentioned you're writing a book about it. What's the larger story or narrative? I mean, look at this as she drives away in the SUV. People are stopping her. Again, there's so much, there's just so much attraction to this case from regular people showing up. What's the larger story you're going to want to tell in that book? I mean, there's so much there.
Well, my head's spinning a bit, Connell, like everybody else. But, you know, there's another case involved here, the Sandra Birchmore murder case, which I don't know if you've talked about on your air in the past, but it's a young girl that died. It was originally called a hanging, and then recently the feds stepped in and charged a police officer with killing her and staging it as a suicide. A lot of the same investigators that were involved in the Sandra Birchmore case were involved in this Karen Reed case. So there is a big story to tell here about corruption in this county and frankly, you know, misdeeds by the police that were involved in both cases. So that's really what you're seeing with this wild celebration out here. These people are angry that they can't trust the police in their own towns.
What would you say about that, Misty, as this SUV Karen Reed drives away? You see the police officers screen left about what a case like this, high profile, does for trust in the authorities.
Well, certainly this case was that this was on display because we heard from so many people outside that courthouse just when we were covering this, Connell, but even all day, there's been a lot of interviews. People said this could have been me. This could have been somebody in my family. I easily could have been the target of some kind of police cover up. So clearly in this community, there is that level of distrust. And what you see happen in order to hopefully right that wrong, because having trust between communities and law enforcement is imperative, is investigations into the police conduct, whether it be internal affairs or sometimes the federal government comes in and conducts an investigation. That did happen here relating to this particular case. One of the reasons you saw Michael Proctor being removed from his position and disciplined was because of those types of internal investigations. So certainly there is a lot of scrutiny, and it requires the agencies to really go and do that deep dive to correct those wrongs wherever they might be.
Misty Marris, Dave Wedge on the breaking news from Dedham, Massachusetts, just outside of Boston. Coverage continues here on NewsNation on a busy day. Of course, we have a lot of other news to cover as well.